The wind screamed across the high plains, a relentless moan that carried dust, smoke, and something older, sorrow. Beneath that sky, stretched like bruised silk over the horizon, a woman stood with a shotgun in her arms and blood on her dress. Her name was Sarah Whitaker, and she was no longer just a homesteader. She was a mother without a child. And a mother without a child is the most dangerous kind of thing. The prairie had been her home for 8 years. She and her daughter Emily had built their life together with blistered hands and borrowed faith, on a parcel of land that came with no guarantees, just hope and hardship. The soil was stubborn, the winters were cruel, but they endured, because that's what you did when you had no one else. When your husband died in the war, and your family stopped writing letters after your decision to marry a Union man, you held fast to what remained. For Sarah, that had been Emily and this land. Now both were gone. 2 weeks earlier, Sarah had been baking cornbread when she heard hooves on the dry earth. She wiped her hands on her apron, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and stepped onto the porch, squinting against the sun. 5 men approached, one with a gold watch chain glittering against his black vest. That was Silas McAllister. He didn't need to introduce himself. Everyone for 30 miles knew the man who claimed half the county with forged deeds, charm, and a blood-slick smile. He spoke like a gentleman and shot like an outlaw. He'd built an empire from stolen soil and unmarked graves. Silas dismounted and tipped his hat to Sarah like she was someone he'd been meaning to call on. "Ms. Whitaker," he said, voice oily smooth. "You're on disputed land. There's been a clerical oversight at the registrar's office, and I'm afraid this plot's no longer yours." Sarah had narrowed her eyes. "I buried my husband on this land. I birthed my daughter in that cabin. I've got papers with my name on them." Silas's smile never cracked. "Paper ain't the law out here. Presence is." Behind him, the other men, grimy, armed, half drunk already, grinned. One spat. Another adjusted the rifle slung over his back. Sarah knew what they were, wolves in waistcoats. She'd seen what men like them did when they thought the world wouldn't notice. "Then I suggest you turn around," she said coldly. "Because I'm present and I ain't leaving." Silas took a step closer. This doesn't need to get ugly, but it did. Fast. The first shot cracked like thunder. It wasn't Sarah who fired. It was one of Silas's men, nervous, twitchy, finger too quick on the trigger. The bullet tore through the thin wood of the doorframe and ricocheted inside. A second passed. Then a sound came from within the cabin. Not loud, not angry. Just a small, sudden cry. "Emily!" Sarah screamed before she even knew why. Her legs moved, on instinct, carrying her through the door, across the creaking floorboards, and into the kitchen, where her daughter lay sprawled on the ground. A tiny pool of red bloomed beneath her white dress. The smell of iron and bread mixed in the air. The shotgun clattered from Sarah's hands. She dropped to her knees, cradling Emily's small body, whispering her name again and again, like it might stitch time back together. Emily's eyes found hers. "Mama," she whispered. And then, nothing. A silence deeper than death itself settled in Sarah's chest. The kind that doesn't go away. Not ever. Her hands, still stained with flour, smeared blood across her child's cheek. Behind her, the men were shouting, something about mistakes, about getting the hell out before anyone came, but she didn't hear them. Not then. When one of them dragged her from the cabin, she barely fought. She was too heavy with grief. When they struck her, when they kicked her in the ribs, when Silas leaned in close and muttered that he was sorry things turned out this way, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at him like she was memorizing his face, not out of fear, out of need. Because names could be forgotten, but faces stayed. They left her there, bleeding in the dirt. And when they set fire to the cabin, they didn't look back. But Sarah did not die. She woke at dawn 2 days later beneath the twisted limbs of a cottonwood, half covered in ash and blackened soot. Her body screamed with pain. Her left arm was broken, her ribs fractured, her skin blistered. But her heart, that old, iron-cast heart, beat steady, because grief had a way of hardening you into something else. She crawled, for hours, toward the only shelter she knew, an old root cellar buried behind the barn. They hadn't torched that, probably hadn't even noticed it in the dark. There, she found a canteen, 2 strips of dried venison, and a rusted tin of morphine powder. Enough to stay alive, not enough to live. Days passed. Fever came. So did the dreams. She saw Emily standing in the doorway, eyes sad but strong. She wasn't crying. She was waiting. When Sarah finally stood, the world tilted, but her purpose anchored her. She buried what was left of her daughter in the blackened clearing where wildflowers had once grown. She spoke no words. She had none left. She marked the grave with a stone and carved 3 things into it. Emily Whittaker, beloved, taken. Then she began to walk. At first she didn't know where she was going, just that she had to go. Somewhere, between the ashes and the silence, she'd decided. She would not write letters. She would not plead for justice from courts run by men like Silas. She would take back what was hers, and for every name involved in her daughter's murder, she would carve a new one into the dirt, a name not forgotten. The land was cruel in early spring. The nights froze your fingers and the days scorched your skin. Coyotes watched from the brush, snakes hid in the rocks, but none of them scared her. She was no longer something that could be broken. She reached a town called Crow's Neck after 6 days, limping, sunburned, and hollow-eyed. A bartender offered her whiskey out of pity. She didn't take it. She wanted names, not comfort. In the back room of a saloon, she found a man who used to work McAllister's land deals. He remembered her, called her a ghost. She smiled at that. "You'll give me their names," she said, cocking the stolen revolver. He did. He gave her 5. She didn't shoot him. He was a coward, not a killer. Back in the stables, she bought a horse with what little coin she had left. The stable hand gave her a strange look. "Where you headed, Ma'am?" She cinched the saddle straps, and didn't answer for a long time. The wind picked up again, carrying smoke on its tail. "Back," she said finally. "To hell." Then she rode. Her face had changed by then. Thinner, drawn. But her eyes, that was where the difference truly lived. No longer soft, no longer searching. Now they burned. Each mile she travelled brought her closer to the men on that list. Each sunrise meant she was still breathing, still strong enough to hold the gun steady. They thought she had died. They had. Buried her with fire and smoke and walked away. But Sarah Whittaker had risen, and she was coming for them. One by one, with a bullet for each name. The storm rolled in like a warning, low thunder rumbling across the Montana sky as Sarah guided her horse through the narrowing trail between 2 ridgelines. Rain had turned the earth to sludge, the wheels of an old wagon buried axle deep ahead, long abandoned. Her coat clung to her like a second skin, soaked and stiff with grime. She'd been riding for 3 days straight, fueled by coffee boiled bitter over a fire and the relentless churn of her purpose. Each night she slept with the revolver under her bedroll, her back to a tree, her eyes never fully closing. She knew the land could kill just as easily as a bullet. Wolves howled from distant hills. A cougar had stalked her for an entire night near Copper Ridge, its yellow eyes flickering from the brush. She hadn't blinked for hours, the firelight dancing in her pupils, her hand clutching the knife at her side. It didn't pounce. Maybe it saw something in her, a weariness, a resolve that it understood. Maybe it knew she'd fight until they were both dead. Survival was its own kind of war. A test she passed again and again, not through strength but through something more stubborn. Something dug deep beneath the marrow. She didn't ask for mercy. She didn't offer it. On the morning of the fourth day, she arrived at Dagger Creek. It wasn't much of a town, just a line of buildings along a mud track nestled against the tree line. A saloon, a general store, a livery. Most of the folks, they kept their heads down, just trying to last another winter. But Sarah wasn't there to trade or to rest. She was there for the first name on her list. Thomas Reeve. He used to ride with Silas McAllister. Had a mean drawl and a scar down the middle of his face from a cattle branding gone wrong. Last she heard, he'd taken up as a self-appointed sheriff in Dagger Creek, handing out frontier law with the same twisted grin he wore the night he stood on her porch. She stabled her horse, paid in silver coins so worn you could barely see the eagle on them, and stepped into the saloon. It smelled of sweat, old beer, and burnt meat. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots, but no one turned to look. That was fine. She preferred it that way. Thomas was at the back table, boots on the bench, a bottle of whiskey in one hand, a card game in the other. He laughed too loud at nothing, smacking the shoulder of the man beside him. His beard was longer, gut a little softer, but she'd know that voice anywhere. Sarah didn't speak. She walked up to the table, pulled the revolver from her coat, and placed it on the green. Felt in front of him. The laughter died. Thomas looked up, mouth half open. "You," he started. That's all he managed. She pistol-whipped him across the temple, fast and brutal, before he could move. His chair toppled, his head hitting the floor with a sickening crack. The men at the table shot up, hands hovering at their belts. "Don't," she said, calm and flat. "He's mine." No one did. She dragged him out into the street. Rain was still falling, though softer now, like the land itself was holding its breath. He came to as she dropped him in the mud. "Sarah," he groaned. You're supposed to be dead," she finished. He tried to reach for the knife at his boot. She stepped on his wrist. Hard. "I've got your name, Reeve," she said. "I watched you smile when my daughter bled out. I remember the way you lit the torch." His eyes widened. "It wasn't me. I didn't mean..." Silas gave the order. "I was just present," she said. That was enough. She left him alive, not out of mercy, because there were worse things than dying. She carved Emily's initials into the wood of the saloon's doorframe and nailed Thomas's silver deputy badge beside them. A warning. She kept riding. The next two names took longer to find. One was buried in the canyon country, squatting in an outlaw camp built from scrap iron and rotted wood. His name was Boone, and he didn't go quietly. They fought in the river, water red with both their blood. He tried to drown her. She sank her teeth into his cheek and pulled the trigger underwater. The echo of the shot was swallowed by the current. She burned the camp after looting what she needed. Ammo, food, another revolver. The second was easier. A man named Ward, hiding in a mining town called Gold Hollow, living under a different name, working as a foreman. He begged, claimed he hadn't known a child was in the house. Sarah didn't reply. She just left the bullet casing on his desk after it was done. No one followed her out of the building. Somewhere between Gold Hollow and Drybone Flats, she began to feel the weight of it all. Not just the killing, but the way the killing didn't change the past. Emily's voice still echoed in her sleep. Her laughter, the way she used to braid grass into crowns. Vengeance had a taste, like copper and ash. It didn't numb the pain. It only focused it. On the seventh night of her journey, she was caught in a sudden storm. The skies cracked open like something alive and furious. Lightning danced across the ridge in jagged lines. She took shelter in the mouth of a cave, but the cold sank into her bones. Fever followed. She shivered for hours, drifting between memory and dream, clinging to consciousness by fingernails. She saw Emily again, standing by the river, hair blowing in the wind. "You're going too far, Mama," the vision whispered. "Come back." But Sarah wasn't ready to come back. Not yet. When she awoke, it was to the sound of footsteps. Careful, steady. Someone was approaching the cave. She reached for her gun, tried to lift it, but her hand trembled too much. A man stepped into view. Tall, lean, dressed in furs and leather. His face was shadowed beneath a broad-brimmed hat, and his eyes were like flint chips, dark, unreadable. He didn't speak, just looked at her for a long time, then crouched beside her, placing a bundle of dried herbs and water beside her mouth. She didn't trust him, but she was too weak to fight. He built a fire, wrapped her in his own cloak, and waited. Days passed. She recovered slowly, the fever loosening its grip, her wounds beginning to knit. He didn't ask questions, just hunted, cooked, and watched the horizon. Once, she caught him carving something into a piece of antler, a design like interlocked stars. When she finally found her strength, she asked, "Why help me?" He shrugged. "You're walking the same trail I did once. The path only leads to one place." "And what place is that?" He looked at her, solemn, alone. His name was Elias Blackthorne, a man of few words, fewer smiles. But there was a gravity to him, like the land itself had shaped his silence. Sarah didn't ask what he'd lost. She could see it in the way he never sat with his back exposed, in the way he checked every shadow before resting. There were ghosts in him. She had plenty of her own. They travelled together for a while. Not as partners. Not yet. Just two souls, on converging paths. He taught her to track by scent, to listen for the silence between the birdsong. He showed her how to make poultices from pine sap, and what kind of bark burned the longest. And slowly, without ever speaking of it, a trust began to form. One night, she awoke from a nightmare. Emily calling for her from inside a burning cabin. And she found Elias already awake, staring into the fire. "You dream loud," he said without turning. She nodded. "I used to," he added. Sarah looked at him. "What stopped them?" He shook his head. "They didn't. You just get better at waking, up before they finish." They didn't speak after that, but the silence wasn't empty. By the time they reached the edge of McAllister territory, the line between ally and stranger had begun to blur. She still didn't know exactly what Elias wanted or why he stayed, but he never questioned her purpose, never tried to stop her, and when they stood on the cliffside, looking down at the rolling valley below, the last stretch before McAllister's estate, Sarah spoke quietly. "There's only one name left." Elias just nodded. The wind stirred the trees like breath against skin. She tightened her coat, placed her hand over the satchel where she kept Emily's locket, and whispered, not to Elias, but to the memory riding beside her every mile. "I'm almost there, baby girl." Almost. The sun sank behind the Bitterroot Mountains, bleeding red into the sky like an open wound. Below, nestled among twisted pine and rugged canyons, lay the compound that Silas McAllister called home. It wasn't a homestead, not in the way Sarah remembered them. This was a fortress, timbered walls high and thick, a perimeter watchtower with a bell, and at least a dozen men on patrol. Smoke curled from chimneys, heavy with the scent of roasted meat and kerosene. Even now, in the fading light, it pulsed with life. Men laughing, horses shifting in the stables, music drifting faintly from inside. Sarah knelt on the overlook, dirt and rock digging into her knees, eyes narrowed through a spyglass she'd scavenged 2 towns back. She counted 9 visible sentries, probably more inside. A freight wagon had just rolled through the front gate, loaded with sacks and crates, supplies for winter. McAllister planned to dig in. He wasn't afraid. He thought he was untouchable. She had 1 bullet for him, and 100 reasons to use it. Behind her, Elias stepped lightly, keeping to the cover of the trees. He didn't speak until he was close, enough to whisper. "Too many guards to go in loud." Sarah handed him the spyglass. "I'm not looking for loud. I'm looking for clean." He studied the layout, grunted, There's a ridge that cuts behind the stables. If we move before moonrise, we might make the east wall without being seen. Might. He gave her a sidelong glance. You got a better plan? She didn't, but planning wasn't what kept her alive all this time. It was purpose. That, and something Elias still hadn't said aloud, though she felt it humming beneath his silence. The same need, the same burn that couldn't be smothered with time or whiskey or prayer. She turned to him. You don't have to go any farther. His jaw tightened. I've come this far. I'm not asking you to die for me. I'm not here for you, he said evenly. I'm here for him. That was the closest thing to confession she'd ever heard from him. She didn't press further. Instead, she laid out what little gear they had. 2 pistols, 1 rifle, 6 bullets each, a coil of rope, and a rusted lockpick set Elias had carried since their 3rd stop. It had saved them once already, in that forgotten rail shack outside Iron Mesa. They waited for the moon to rise, their backs to the trees, breaths slow and measured. Below, the compound glowed with lamplight. Inside those walls, Silas McAllister lived in comfort, built on ruin. Her ruin. She remembered his face too clearly. The way his smile curled like smoke. The precise way he folded his hands when he offered her false sympathy as her house burned. That man believed in ownership, not just of land, but of people's fear. Sarah had no fear left to give. They moved as shadows when the time came, silent as snowfall, swift as wolves. Elias led the descent, guiding her down the ridge, fingers brushing tree trunks, eyes always scanning for motion. They made it to the eastern wall by midnight. The compound was quieter now, most of the men asleep or drunk. A low murmur echoed from inside the main hall. Laughter, then the thud of boots on floorboards. Sarah pressed a hand to the wooden wall. It was cold, rough, solid, the last threshold. Elias knelt by the service gate, fiddling with the lock. A soft click, then another. The door swung open an inch, just wide enough. He looked at her. She nodded. They slipped inside. The courtyard was empty, but lamplight from the windows painted gold streaks on the dirt. Every creak of leather, every scuff of boot felt amplified in the stillness. A dog barked once from the far side of the yard. Sarah froze. It didn't bark again. Elias pointed toward the stable. Cut through. Less light. They moved low, across the open space, darting behind barrels and carts. The stable door groaned as they eased it open, the scent of hay and horses thick in their lungs. Inside, a single boy slept on a pile of sacks, a rifle tucked under his arm. Sarah paused, staring at him. Couldn't be more than 16. She took the rifle gently from his arms and set it against the wall. Let him sleep. This wasn't his war. Beyond the stables lay the servants' quarters, and beyond that, the hall. Silas's room would be upstairs, east wing, 2nd door on the left. She remembered from the night he visited their farm. He'd spoken about his house the way a man might speak about a mistress, admiring, possessive. They made it to the hall without incident. The building loomed above them, 2 stories of shadow and warm glow. The front entrance was locked, but the side door, meant for kitchen staff, was not. They entered. It was warmer inside than Sarah expected. Rugs on the floor, paintings on the walls. Everything gleamed like it had been polished daily, as if wealth could scrub out blood. She moved with purpose, Elias at her shoulder. They passed an open door, kitchen. A woman inside stood washing dishes. She didn't see them. Another door, study, empty. A fire smouldered in the hearth. Then the staircase. They climbed 1 step at a time, slow, steady, the wood groaning beneath them like it resented the weight. At the top, the hallway stretched in both directions, quiet and still. Elias whispered, "Second on the left." She nodded, fingers wrapped around her pistol, breath held so tight it hurt. They reached the door. Sarah pressed her ear to it. Nothing. She opened it. Silas lay in bed, snoring softly. Alone. A glass of brandy on the nightstand. A book, face down, on the covers. He looked older than she remembered. Greyer around the temples. But not enough. Not nearly enough. She stepped inside, boots soundless on the rug, and raised her gun. And then something unexpected happened. Silas opened his eyes. He didn't flinch, didn't cry out, just looked at her, as if he'd always known this moment would come. "Sarah," he said softly, "I wondered when you'd show." She didn't answer. He sat up slowly, raising his hands. "You want to kill me. I get it. I deserve it. But if you do, the men downstairs, my men, they'll hunt you. You'll never make it out." She kept the gun steady. "You should worry about yourself." Silas sighed. "You think this ends with me? That Emily's death began and ended at my hand?" "No, Sarah, there were others. Men more powerful than I ever was. Men who gave me orders. They're still out there." She faltered. Just for a second. That name, Emily, spoken by his mouth, it curdled the air. Silas leaned forward. "I'll give you names, real names. You can finish what you started, but only if I live." She stared at him. The fire burned low behind his eyes, a flicker of desperation beneath the calm. He wasn't in control anymore, and he knew it. Elias stepped into the room, silent, watching. Sarah's hands trembled. Not from fear, from choice. "You think you're useful," she said. "I know I am. You think I care?" And then she lowered the pistol just slightly, stepped closer, and struck him with the butt. Not a killing blow, a silencing one. He crumpled, unconscious, a crimson line forming above his temple. Elias blinked. "You're not going to kill him?" "I will," she said, "but not yet. First I want those names." Together they bound. Silas gagged him and lowered him out the back window using the rope. It was risky, a miracle no one saw, but by dawn they were gone. Silas tied across the back of a stolen horse, mouth stuffed with cloth, his eyes wild with the realization that she wasn't done. Not yet. They rode hard into the hills, disappearing into the fog. Elias rode beside, her, quiet, thoughtful. Finally he asked, "Why let him live?" She stared ahead. "Because vengeance is easy. Justice takes patience." And somewhere, in the distance, the wind changed. The cabin was hidden deep in the scarred wilderness north of the Gallatin River, surrounded by gnarled trees and wind-whipped silence. The walls were thick with moss, the roof patched with animal hides, smoke rising gently from the crooked chimney. Inside, the shadows danced across wooden beams, cast by a fire that crackled low and angry in the stone hearth. Silas McAllister was tied to a chair in the center of the room, arms lashed behind him, blood dried to a crust along his hairline. He hadn't spoken in hours, not since Sarah broke his nose after his second lie. She stood now in front of him, expression carved from stone, her fingers tracing the letters on the worn pages of his old ledger. Names, dates, bribes, deeds. A ledger of sins masquerading as business. She had it all. It had taken 3 days of sleepless interrogation, half-rationed food, and more threats than she could count. But finally, Silas had broken. Not with a scream, not with tears, but with a bitter smirk and one hoarse sentence. "You'll never get them all. They're ghosts, Sarah. They live in the marrow of this land." She didn't reply then. She doesn't reply now. Elias paced near the door, restless. He hadn't slept either. His jaw was clenched, his steps sharp and deliberate. Every so often, his eyes flicked to Silas like he was trying to burn him alive without ever drawing a weapon. "You're sure about this?" Elias asked finally, breaking the tense quiet. Sarah nodded. "The names he gave, they lead somewhere real. U.S. Land Office records in Bozeman. A judge paid to look away. A surveyor who redrew boundary. lines to favor a railroad tycoon, and every step of it started with Silas. They thought she was just a girl in the way. Elias glanced toward the dark window where snow fell thick and silent. They won't just let this go. I don't need them to, she said. I'm not hiding anymore. Silas chuckled, dry and cracked. You think you're a hero now, a mother with a gun and a grudge. Nothing more. Sarah walked to him slowly. Her boots thudded against the wooden floor. She crouched, eye level now, the firelight catching the glint in her eyes. I'm not a hero, she said. I'm what comes after. She rose, tucked the ledger into her satchel, and turned to Elias. We leave at first light. And him? She paused. The weight of that choice pressed against her like a storm front. He stays, she said. Chained, cold, hungry. Let him rot with the ghosts he made. Elias raised an eyebrow. Not the ending I expected. Sarah shrugged. Let his death be slower than a bullet. Let time kill him. Before sunrise, they rode out, cutting across frozen plains and pine-cloaked ridges. Sarah felt the burden lighten with each mile. Not the pain. No, that still lived in the tightness of her chest, the whisper of her daughter's voice in every gust of wind. But the anger. It was no longer wildfire. It was steel. Focused. Controlled. Bozeman was 2 days' ride. They reached it on the second night, just as a blizzard began to roll in. Snow swept through the streets, half obscuring the lamplight, draping the town in an eerie quiet. They lodged above a tailor's shop, a room barely large enough for 2 bedrolls and a table, but it had warmth and a door that locked. That was enough. The next morning, Sarah walked into the federal office with her coat still damp, the ledger clutched in gloved hands. The clerk at the desk, a rail-thin man with spectacles too big for his face, barely glanced up until he saw the badge Elias wore on his coat, a US Army relic pulled from his own past, polished just enough to be convincing. I need to speak. To a Judge Holloway, Sarah said. Now, the clerk blinked. I don't think... Elias stepped forward. You thinking or stalling? They were shown in immediately. The judge was a round man with soft hands and a thick beard, eyes that twitched too much to hide guilt. Sarah dropped the ledger onto his desk like a gavel, opened it to a marked page, watched his face drain of colour as he read. This is treason, he muttered. No, she corrected. This is theft, arson, murder, conspiracy, and every name in that book leads to more. Holloway swallowed hard. And what do you want exactly? Justice. You won't get it with just this. You'll need testimony, signatures, witnesses. Sarah leaned in. I'll get them. You're willing to put yourself on trial to do it. I already did. For the next 4 weeks, Sarah became something she never intended. An investigator, a voice, a symbol of reckoning. She tracked down land agents, blackmailed clerks, and even sat face to face with the very surveyor who erased her family's name from the maps. Elias never left her side. He didn't speak for her, but he stood close enough to remind them all what would happen if they didn't listen. When word spread of Silas McAllister's disappearance, a handful of hired men rode north to find him. They didn't return. Others were more cautious. The trial was set for the spring, and in the meantime, Sarah handed over every document, every sworn confession, every name. She never spoke about Emily to the press, not directly, but the papers printed her face, and headlines called her the widow of the West, the mother who rode for blood, the bullet keeper. She hated everyone. Elias knew. He never called her anything but Sarah. One night, deep into a particularly brutal freeze, Sarah sat on the roof of the boarding house, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the stars. Elias climbed up beside her, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. You ever wonder if it's enough? He asked. Sarah took the cup. Every day. You did what most wouldn't. She sipped slowly. I didn't come this far to be admired. What? Then? She exhaled. white breath drifting toward the moon. I just want to hear her laugh again, one more time. Elias nodded, said nothing. The night before the first hearing, they received word. Silas was dead. A trapper found his body in the hills, still bound, wolves half finished with him. The snow had preserved the face long enough for identification. Some might have called it justice. Sarah didn't. She just closed her eyes, clenched her fists, and let the silence have him. At the courthouse, Sarah stood tall before the panel of judges, her voice steady as she recounted every step. The fire, the men, the blood. She named each one, didn't flinch, didn't cry. She told them the story not like a victim but like a witness who survived the storm and walked out stronger. The judges ruled in her favor. Land returned. Charges pressed. Titles nullified. But it wasn't a victory. Not the kind you celebrate. She and Elias left town before the second trial began. The headlines followed them for a time, but soon the world moved on. It always did. They headed west. No destination, just forward. One night, on the edge of a canyon rimmed in wildflowers and ash, Sarah set a small wooden box on the earth. Inside, Emily's locket, a piece of the burned hearthstone from their old cabin, and a single spent bullet. She lit a fire around it, watched it burn. Elias said nothing. The flames reflected in her eyes, and for the first time in years, there was no hatred behind them, just memory, just love. When the fire died, she stood, picked up her rifle, turned to Elias. "You coming?" He smiled, just a little. Always. And together, they disappeared into the wilderness, two shadows swallowed by dawn, the past behind. Them, but never forgotten. Justice had been served. But peace. Peace was something they would have to carve themselves, one step at a time.